Julia stood by the small window of her modest apartment, a soft morning light spilling onto her face as she gently placed her hand over her growing belly. Her clothes were plain, faded jeans, a long cardigan, and a scarf wrapped gently around her hair. She looked down at her belly and smiled, whispering softly, "Today is your first hospital visit. Let's go see how you're doing, little one." Her eyes sparkled with hope as she picked up a small medical file and stepped out into the morning chill. She walked to the nearest bus stop, the city bustling around her. Cars sped past, people rushed by in designer clothes, but Julia, calm and grounded, waited patiently. She climbed onto the bus, her hands wrapped around the file as if it carried her entire world. The ride was quiet. She stared out the window, her reflection overlaying the city's glass buildings, unaware of what the day would bring. When she finally reached the hospital, she took a deep breath. It towered above her, modern, sleek, with glass walls that shimmered in the sun. It wasn't a place you'd expect someone like Julia to visit, at least not according to society's standards. But she had chosen it for a reason: good doctors, quality care, and because she wanted the best for her child. As she stepped into the lobby, the atmosphere changed. The marble floors gleamed. The walls were lined with artwork. The air was filled with a sterile silence, the kind that humbles and intimidates. She approached the reception desk, smiling warmly, unaware of the eyes already judging her. The receptionist, dressed in a crisp white blouse, barely looked up. Her lips curled slightly as she said coldly, "Are you lost?" "The public clinic is 2 streets down." Julia blinked, unsure if she heard her correctly. "No," she replied gently. "I have an appointment here. Under the name Julia Anderson." The receptionist scoffed. "Here?" she repeated, glancing Julia up and down like she was something left on the sidewalk. A nurse standing nearby leaned in and whispered just loud enough to be heard, "She doesn't even look like she can afford a glass of water here, let alone a checkup." Julia's hands tightened around her file, her heart beginning to race. Still, she stood her ground. "Please," she said softly, "can you just check? I called 2 days ago, but they didn't." The receptionist leaned back in her chair with a sigh of mock frustration. "Ma'am, you need to leave. We don't want to waste time here." Julia's eyes began to well up. The quiet humiliation pressed down on her chest like a weight she couldn't shake off. No one stood up for her. No one even bothered to ask who she was. And so, without another word, she turned and walked away, her shoulders heavy, her heart aching, not just for herself, but for the little life growing inside her. Julia returned home with quiet footsteps, gently closing the door behind her as if the world outside had been too loud, too cruel. Her apartment, though small, felt like a sanctuary. She slipped off her shoes and placed the medical file on the table, untouched. Just as she was about to walk to the kitchen, the door creaked open slightly. Her neighbor, Mrs. Carter, an elderly woman with kind eyes, peeked in from across the hall. "Back so soon?" she asked with a curious frown. "Everything all right, dear?" Julia hesitated for a moment, then forced a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes," she said lightly. "Just a little mix-up with the appointment. I'll go again tomorrow." Mrs. Carter nodded, not entirely convinced, but chose not to press. "All right then. You take care." As the door closed behind her, Julia leaned against the wall, letting the silence settle. Her eyes drifted to the shelf where a single framed photograph sat. She walked over and picked it up, her wedding photo. It wasn't extravagant, no grand ballroom, no designer gown, just a small garden, 2 rings, and the glow of love between her and Alex. In her mind, the memory played like a soft film, Alex smiling as he adjusted her veil, her whispering, "I do," through happy tears. That moment had been pure, untouched by status, unshaken by society. The sun dipped below the skyline as evening crept in. The apartment remained quiet until the sound of a key turning in the lock broke the stillness. Alex stepped in, his presence calm, composed, and comforting. A tall man with thoughtful eyes and a gentle voice. He set his travel bag down and opened his arms, expecting his usual warm welcome. But something was different. Julia greeted him with a smile, but her embrace held hesitation. Alex noticed instantly. "Is everything all right?" he asked softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She nodded too quickly, too rehearsed. "Just tired," she whispered. But Alex wasn't easily fooled. Over dinner, he watched her closely, his instincts quietly observing the weight she tried to hide. Later, as they sat on the couch, the silence stretched until Julia finally exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. They treated me like I didn't belong. They didn't even check the system. They looked at me like I was nothing." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She had already done that. Alex took her hand gently in his. There was no anger in his voice, only a stillness that spoke volumes. "Thank you," he said, "for not creating a scene, for walking away with dignity." Julia looked at him, confused. "But why are you thanking me?" He looked into her eyes and replied, "Because you didn't need to fight them. I will take care of it tomorrow." His words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Behind his calm exterior, something had shifted, something powerful, like a storm gathering quietly in the distance. Julia didn't know what he meant exactly, but she trusted him. She always had. The morning air was crisp as the sleek black McLaren Senna rolled to a silent stop in front of the hospital's grand entrance. Its engine purred low before falling silent, catching the attention of every guard and staff member near the glass doors. Security guards straightened their postures. Nurses paused mid-step. Receptionists looked up from their screens. The rare sight of such a luxury car was enough to make anyone curious, but what followed made their jaws tighten with sudden realization. The driver's door lifted smoothly, and out stepped Alex, sharp in a tailored navy suit, polished shoes clicking against the pavement, his expression unreadable but intense. There was a quiet authority in the way he moved, as if the building itself belonged to him, because, in truth, it did. Inside, whispers had already started before he entered. As he stepped through the doors, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations died. Every head turned. The very receptionist who had humiliated Julia the day before stood frozen behind her desk, her fingers hovering uselessly over the keyboard. The hospital manager, notified of Alex's arrival within seconds, hurried into the lobby, his face pale. Alex didn't waste time. He walked straight to the reception desk, his voice calm but piercing. "Where is the receptionist who was here yesterday morning?" The question hung in the air like thunder before a storm. The receptionist hesitated, already trembling as she stepped forward. The nurse who had laughed beside her the previous day stood slightly behind, unable to meet his gaze. He looked at them, his voice level. "Yesterday, a pregnant woman came here for her appointment. You didn't even let her speak. You dismissed her, mocked her, humiliated her." He paused, letting the silence weigh heavy. "Her name is Julia Anderson. She is my wife." A gasp rippled through the lobby. The receptionist's face turned ghostly white. Sir, we didn't know," she stammered. Alex's tone grew firm, cutting through her words. "You didn't care to know. That's the problem. You looked at her clothes, not her name, not her appointment, not her humanity." The nurse tried to open her mouth to explain, but his gaze silenced her. He turned toward the manager who stood awkwardly to the side, sweat forming at his temples. Is this the kind of staff this hospital prides itself on? The manager shook his head quickly, fumbling for words. Alex didn't wait. I want every member of your front staff retrained, or replaced, today. If this is how they treat one woman, imagine how many others have been silenced before her. No one dared to breathe. Shame clung to every face in the room. The same building that had once judged Julia now stood exposed in the eyes of its owner. Without raising his voice, Alex had delivered a storm, controlled, precise, and unforgettable. And for the first time, the silence in the hospital lobby was not one of luxury, but of reckoning. The next morning, Julia stepped out of a cab in front of the hospital, her heart a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. Alex hadn't told her much, just that she should go back for her appointment. She held her file tightly again, though this time her grip came from nerves, not hope. As she entered through the same glass doors, her eyes scanned the familiar lobby, expecting the same coldness. But everything had changed. The moment she stepped in, the front desk staff stood up. Smiles welcomed her. A nurse offered her a seat. Another brought her water. It was as if the atmosphere had shifted entirely, not just out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. The receptionist from the previous day was gone. In her place stood a new, warmer face who greeted her kindly and checked her appointment immediately. Before Julia could even sit down, a senior doctor approached with a gentle smile. "Mrs. Anderson," he said with a slight bow, "we've been expecting you. Allow me to personally escort you to the VIP maternity suite." Julia blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, thank you," she said, still unsure of what exactly had unfolded. As they walked through the corridor, staff nodded politely, no longer looking through her, but at her, with recognition and perhaps quiet apology. Inside the private suite, everything was serene. Soft lights, fresh flowers, a nurse already preparing the equipment. As Julia sat down, Alex entered the room, calm as ever. He kissed her forehead and sat beside her. She looked at him, eyes full of emotion, and whispered, "Did you really have to make it such a big deal?" Alex took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I didn't do it to show power," he said softly. "I did it to show that kindness shouldn't depend on appearance. What they did to you, they've probably done to others. If we don't stand up for dignity, we lose our own." Julia's eyes welled up, not from sadness, but from gratitude. She leaned her head against his shoulder. In that quiet room, with the faint hum of the ultrasound machine in the background, everything felt peaceful again. Then, a sound filled the room, a tiny, rhythmic heartbeat, fast, strong, alive. Julia looked at the screen, watching the flicker of life growing inside her. And as the nurse smiled and adjusted the image, a soft voice began to narrate, Julia's voice, calm and wise. "People often judge books by their covers," she said, "but sometimes the plainest covers hide the richest stories." The screen faded slowly into the sight of her and Alex holding hands, eyes locked on the monitor, their faces glowing with love and awe. And then, as the final image held for a moment longer, a line appeared across the screen. Simple, powerful, unforgettable. Humanity isn't measured by clothes, status, or money. It's measured by the heart.